can't see my screen, let me know that as well. Okay. So I was thinking about how positive behavioral interventions and supports most closely aligns with assessment, how it impacts assessment. And I think one of the main things is that PBIS impacts student engagement and availability for instruction, which of course directly impacts their performance on assessments. So if our kids aren't engaged in the instruction, they're not feeling safe, supported, they're not being given feedback on their performance, they're not going to perform as well on assessments, right? So we're going to spend time today, hold on. My computer is not letting me shift to the next slide. There we go. We're going to spend time today talking about what is PBIS overall, and then how we've implemented here in Loudoun County Public Schools. We're also going to talk about our data systems, how we tier support for schools, professional development that we use, how we sustain our practices over time, and where we're going now, moving forward towards more of a multi-tiered system of supports. So PBIS sometimes is thought of as a reward system. Sometimes it's thought of as a packaged program where we're just doing ticket systems or prize wheels, and that's really not what PBIS is all about. And I'll share why we do those other things with PBIS. But PBIS is really more of a prevention-oriented approach. It's a framework for teaching appropriate behavior, for sustaining that behavior. Really how we teach behavior should be the same way, how we teach academics should be the same way that we're teaching behavior. Now, the reason that we have different types of ticket systems or recognition programs is that's the fun part. That's how we kind of get kids interested in the expectations that we're teaching. It's also a way to get adults involved and make sure that they're following through with that feedback that we want to provide for kids. PBIS is based on the principles of applied behavior analysis. So it is an evidence-based approach that we're looking at. It is supported through research as well. Our goals are really to maximize performance, maximize academic performance, behavioral performance, social, emotional, or mental health outcomes. And we do that through a number of ways. We want to increase safe and supportive environments for kids. We've got to start with their basic needs before we can expect that they're going to be available for instruction. So we're really looking at who our students are in different schools and what they need when they walk in the door. Of course, PBIS, we want to decrease problem behaviors and increase a more equitable experience for all kids. Positive school culture and climate is a huge part of PBIS, and that's where we're really focusing on building relationships, maintaining those relationships, and building resiliency in kids. So like I noted before, sometimes it's difficult to think about how we teach behavior, but it should be the same as we teach reading, math, and science. We're going to teach a skill, model that skill, practice, and give feedback. The same way we would teach math. So we're teaching addition and subtraction. We're going to model that. We're going to have students practice that skill. And then we're going to tell them what they're doing correctly. And if they're not doing it correctly, we reteach and we remodel and we practice again, and then we evaluate. So we do the same thing with behavior. Oftentimes, we just expect that kids know what behaviors are appropriate, but they really don't always know what's appropriate. And sometimes they get mixed messages as to what's appropriate in one classroom versus another classroom versus other areas of a school, like the library, the cafeteria, the hallways. So we really do need to teach those behavior. We're setting expectations in a common language. So it's not so much, uh-oh, looks like we've lost sound. Can you hear me now? Oh, I'm back. Okay. While we're pausing right here, does anybody have any questions so far? Okay, we'll keep going. Okay, so again, setting expectations. One of the hallmarks of PBIS are setting anchors that you probably see throughout your schools if your schools are implementing PBIS. And those anchors are kind of the big expectations for the entire school. No matter where a student is in the school, the anchors guide their behavior. So we have two examples here. On the left, you have a middle school example, and on the right is an elementary example. So on the left, their anchors are create, lead, inspire, motivate, and believe. And then the school notes what that looks like. So create, walk safely to your destination, stay to the right. I'm not sure actually how that is creative, but that's what's supposed to happen. They have anchors like respect yourself, respect others, and respect property, and then what that looks like. And when we're noting what that looks like, we're doing it in a positive way. So we're not putting in there, don't run, don't talk. We're telling them what we want them to do. Now, most schools start off with school-wide PBIS. Sometimes you'll see the acronym SW PBIS. And that's where we're looking at these anchors and what it means for the whole school, and then maybe for some larger school areas like the cafeteria, hallways, bathrooms, office, playground, that type of thing. And then once that school-wide PBIS is established, then we move into the classrooms. So for Loudoun County Public Schools, we give teachers more flexibility in noting what their expected behaviors are, but tied to those anchors. So for the elementary school that we're seeing on the right, respect yourself. What does that look like in a particular teacher's classroom? So they have some flexibility within their rooms. There we go. So moving on to what it looks like in a classroom overall. We're going to talk a little bit more about what tiers mean, tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3, but PBIS is really a systems level framework. So we're looking at mostly tier 1 core behavioral practices, and then we'll talk about what tier 2 and tier 3 means in a moment, but we're really looking at those core features, what we have in place for all students. So for all students, we'd be teaching those expectations and providing feedback like we talked about, and we're really trying to prevent behavior. So if you can predict it, you can usually prevent it most of the time. As a school psychologist, I would often have teachers ask me to come in and observe a class or observe a student. And as soon as I would come in, they would say, okay, now watch what that student's going to do. I know they're going to do it. And they did it. So they were already able to predict it was going to happen. So we really needed to prevent the behavior before it happened. I included this little graphic. It says, can you help me, Miss Martin? This wasn't covered in any of my education courses. Very few teachers and educational staff have had training on behavior management, classroom management. And it sounds a little odd that through teacher training, they would not have behavior management courses, but that's what we're finding is maybe they've had one class. In some really great institutions, they've had 3, but overall, they're not really getting that training in how to manage their classroom, manage behaviors. And so we provide a lot of training on that. We'll talk about that later when we're talking about professional development. So getting a little bit more specific with Loudoun County Public Schools. We are in the Northern Virginia area. We're a suburb in DC, and we have a lot of growth and a lot of transition. So you can see that we build about 1 to 3 schools every year, large schools, because we're getting about 2,500 or so new students every year. So we are the fastest growing county in the United States, and that definitely presents its own challenges. We also have a lot of movement within the county. So we're constantly having new students come in, but with that, we're also having a lot of movement with administration and teachers. So new schools open, administrators go to that new school, and then we have to fill those positions. So we're constantly retraining because people aren't in the same spot for very long. A little bit about how we first started and where we are now. In 2007 is when PBIS was first implemented, and it was implemented on a voluntary basis, which meant that the previous PBIS coordinators would go out to a school, do a presentation, try to convince them that PBIS was a good thing to implement within their school, and then the staff would vote on whether or not they wanted to implement. So if 80% of the staff said yes, then they would implement. But there were some schools that said no thanks. So that was always a little awkward. But in 2012, our school board created a discipline task force to look at disparities in discipline. And that really revealed that we had discipline disproportionality, mainly for the student subgroups of African American students, Hispanic students, and students with disabilities. So at that point, our school superintendent mandated that all schools would implement PBIS. So that was a huge turning point. And we brought on, gosh, I think it was maybe about 30 or so schools in 1 year. So that was, it was a big challenge, but now all schools are implementing PBIS. We gather fidelity data using something called the Tiered Fidelity Inventory, which is through a company called PBIS Apps. And with that, we can look at how well PBIS is implemented within each school and across the district. And I just looked at the data this morning because our schools are completing their individual tiered fidelity inventories right now. And we have 88% implementation, full implementation, which really means that our teams are fully implemented. Our evaluation standards are being implemented with fidelity. and the overall framework is being implemented with fidelity. So those are, it's a great number. We keep rising every year as we do more and more training, and more people really understand what PBIS is and that it really goes beyond those reward systems. So moving to last year, the beginning of 2017, we developed the Office of Multi-Tiered System of Supports. And that really encompasses PBIS, response to intervention, and mental health, with the hopes that we can integrate all three of those and have the same teams, the same conversations, really looking at that whole child approach. We'll talk more about that later. We have some pretty sophisticated ways to look at our discipline disproportionality data. And so we track that on a monthly basis and then, of course, on an annual basis. This is the data for the end of 2017, 2018. Our suspension rate was at 1%, meaning that we probably suspended about 820 students. Our rate is the lowest of any division around us, but we still have disproportionality within a few subgroups: African American students, Hispanic students, and students with disabilities. So we are working on that, and I'll tell you how we're doing that in a little bit. So how we bring about schools as we build 1 to 3 new schools every year. There's always communication with the principal of a new school about 6 to 8 months prior to their opening. So I'm having conversations with, we're opening 2 new schools next year. I'm having conversations with those principals now about what PBIS is, how that can be implemented from the beginning. And luckily, those 2 principals were already here in our system, and so they're very familiar with PBIS and how to implement from the very beginning. If they were not current administrators within Loudoun County, we definitely would want to establish that buy-in and the commitment because without that, PBIS just doesn't get very far. So every year we have a new team training. It's a full 2-day training that's provided by Dr. Terry Scott from the University of Kentucky, one of our founding fathers in PBIS, I guess you could say. But he does a lot of work with us. And what he does is come in and he trains new teams on the principles of PBIS and how to plan for PBIS within their school. So there's a lot of time to work on individual school tasks, like developing the anchors, the expectations that go along with it, what that's really going to look like for their school. We invite the new schools to that training, but we also invite existing schools that may be rebranding PBIS, or maybe they have a lot of new team members. They can also come to that training. So every year we have about 60 to 80 staff members at that training. One of the great things about the way we implement PBIS in Loudoun County is that we have a coaching model. And so every school has an internal coach and an external coach. And those coaches also attend the new coach training at the beginning of the school year. So we give them a lot of training, and I'll talk about what they do here in a moment. There, in our PBIS department, there are 2 of us. So there's me, the PBIS coordinator, and then there's a PBIS consulting teacher. And we're the ones who are mostly in charge of managing PBIS throughout the county and the contributions of our coaches. So we also do site visits with all the schools, but we do more site visits with the new schools just to make sure that they're able to implement their teaming structures and really build that framework well.